The book of James might be one of my favorite books in the New Testament, and it's very unique and it's slightly different from some of the other books that surround it, which we'll get into a little bit. Both of its style of writing, some of its content, as well as the what we're going to see, kind of the wisdom tradition that lies behind it. So, first, let's talk about James in general. We believe very strongly that this letter was written by the Apostle James, who was the brother of Jesus and who was the leader of the church in Jerusalem. So, this was a highly Jewish community of people. James died in about 62 AD or so. So, we realize this letter was probably 50s, very early 60s. And the fact that the author, James, doesn't really need to clarify on who he was very much often helps people point to the way that this was obviously the prominent James, the leader of the church. Everyone knows who this guy is. Very well known, very respected. He was respected also, this is important, not just for having prestige or a position of power. That didn't mean a lot in the early church. James was respected for his piety, his commitment to Christ, and his care for the poor and those who were downtrodden. He was known as somebody who was compassionate and really sought out to help everyone in need. And so this letter picks up a lot of those themes. He begins by addressing it to the 12 tribes, which you might hear that and like, what's going on there? It just helps to know James was a Jewish man and he was leading a predominantly Jewish church in Jerusalem. Where other letters we've read, like say Galatians, Paul is writing to a mostly Gentile, former pagan group of people out in Asia Minor. James is writing to his brothers and sisters who share his Jewish roots predominantly in his community. Although that doesn't in any way mean that James doesn't apply to all of us. What we'll actually see is James's arguments, thing he says, are really kind of universal ideas that apply to all of us. And so what I want to start is with the style of writing of James. Now, this can be kind of a new concept for some people. It can be a little difficult, so I want to walk through it. The book of James is written in a style that we often refer to as wisdom literature. Now, wisdom literature is very different and distinct from other kinds of literature, especially what we might call prophetic literature. And here's the key difference. When we say something is prophetic, talking about the Bible, we're not talking about inspired as much. That's slightly different. God's behind both writings. But prophetic is very much, to use kind of an old phrase, thus saith the Lord. So the book of Isaiah is a prophetic book because Isaiah was a prophet who was hearing directly from God, speaking into a specific situation and telling people exactly what God was saying. In the Old Testament, that was different from wisdom literature, which wisdom, the idea of wisdom is kind of this, what brings about the best life? What brings about success? What brings about goodness? And so all cultures had wisdom literature, but Jewish and then Christian literature wanted to argue that the kind of life that patterns itself after, in the Old Testament, Torah, the Word of God, in the New Testament, Jesus, the Christ, brings about the best kind of life. Here's the biggest difference to understand about wisdom literature versus prophetic literature. One, wisdom literature tends to be more general. It doesn't get super specific. When Jeremiah is prophesying, he's speaking to these specific people about this specific situation, this nation at this time period. Wisdom literature is more, this is generally true of all people. So Proverbs is a good example of wisdom literature. It also tends to be like Proverbs, more topical, or whereas Romans is like an argument from start to finish, or Hebrews, the one we just finished. Wisdom literature can be more like, here's a true thing, and here's a true thing, more of a collection. And what's important, and this is where it gets a little bit dicey, is sometimes when you read James, it can be a little bit difficult because he makes pretty strong statements about things. And what you want to understand, what I mean by strong, is generally speaking, and this isn't necessarily a theology class, but I want to give you a quick highlight of this. Prophetic literature is meant to be understood as promises from God. God is saying this right now. Wisdom literature is more what is generally true about God's world. So if you read the book of Proverbs, you have to be careful that you're not assuming every single sentence is a promise from God that this will absolutely happen. And the reason why I can justify that scripturally is because other wisdom books, like Ecclesiastes or the book of Job, kind of show that, wisdom literature gives you a general idea of what's usually true, but there are always going to be instances. The rain's still going to fall on the just and the unjust alike. Even though, Proverbs says if you work hard, you'll succeed. Well, sometimes people work hard and things still happen. Sometimes people don't work hard and win the lottery. But generally speaking, this is true. And you see a little bit of that in James. You see a little bit of him giving some thoughts and ideas that, generally speaking, about the Christian life, this is important. Along with that, the book of James then is very focused on behavior. It's a lot of behavior. It's a lot of action. It's a lot of here's how you should live, which fits very well with wisdom literature. Wisdom literature wants to focus on the kind of actions, the kind of day-to-day practical things you and I can do in order to bring about the kind of life we're looking for. Well, as Christians, we're looking for the life that Jesus is offering. So James wants to say the truest, greatest form of wisdom is to pattern your life after the living word, Jesus. So similar to Proverbs, it gives a lot of insight in day-to-day living to followers of Jesus, things that are true in practice, that work, that we apply to our lives. It's a bit less theological. We just finished the book Hebrews, which was very theological, very dense and philosophical, and high priests and Jesus greater than the angels. James is a bit more like, take care of the poor, which might be one of the reasons why I kind of enjoy it. I like highly deep theoretical, philosophical stuff, but sometimes does this work? So the purpose for writing, James doesn't give you a clear purpose. He doesn't write and say, this is why I'm writing this. It's more of a general letter. But when you understand the cultural situation that James was probably speaking into, it kind of takes on shape. In the ancient world, and this is so different, not really, status was everything. Status was everything. Now, what has changed is how we go about getting status. But there's something, money, power, wealth, all those kind of things. But in the West, especially in America, coming out of American Revolution and all these kind of things, we've changed a bit. We're a bit more accepting of everybody, especially in today's kind of 2023 world, whatever. It's a little bit easier to accept people at different levels. But in the ancient world, everything was about status. If you were here and someone was here, you're better than them. That's just the way it worked. And among the Greco-Romans, this was just your status meant everything to you. And there was a great social divide between the classes. It looked a bit more like India looks today than America. And so the Jews were not immune to this. Even though they were God's people, they were following this example. And even among Jewish culture, there was a lot of status and things like that. And James is just this strong, diehard advocate for the poor and the lower class and the people without, that in society, well, they belong down here. And James is like, oh, I'm going to fight for these people. And so a lot of his wisdom book is talking to people with resources. It seems like a lot of times he's talking to the people at the top, the people with money, the people with power, and reminding them what it looks like as a follower of Jesus to care about everyone and how the church and its relationships should work together, that those with much should take care of with those with little. And so the big idea speaking into this for James is faith in action, the practical implications of faith. That, the fact for James that you as a Christian community are still fighting and warring over who's better and the rich are staying up here and the poor are being pushed down here. For James, that's terrible. And for him, that's a sign that your faith isn't genuine and it's not being put into practice the way it should be. For James, it makes no sense for a person to say they have faith and they're committed to this Christ, this King, and then they're not choosing to actually do what this king told them to do. And in this case specifically, oftentimes what this king told them to do is to take care of the poor. So he calls us out from the way the world does things into a new community that does things differently, of people defined by a different mindset and a different set of priorities that focus around elevating and lifting up the poor and the lower, the oppressed, living in love and humility, doing all the things that Jesus told us to do. And James was his brother. So James, for 30 some years, whatever, however old he was, James watched his brother model this. And now he's saying, if you want to follow Jesus, here's what it looks like. You can't say you have faith and not obey Jesus' call to care for the poor, to be kind, to be generous, all these kind of things. Now, contrary to some big historical arguments that have taken place over the book of James, going especially back into the Reformation era, Martin Luther really wrestled with this. James says some strong statements about faith that almost seem to contradict Paul a little bit. There are people who argue that maybe like James and Paul disagreed because Paul was all like, we're saved by grace through faith, not through works. And then James turns around and says, faith without works is dead. And I think what's important is to understand as you read this letter, James is not fighting with Paul. He's not in conflict with him. He's saying something a little bit different. James isn't talking about salvation. James isn't talking about what it takes to be brought in, to receive new life, to enter in the kingdom. James is talking practically about what day-to-day looks like as a follower of Jesus. It's an explanation of faith in practice, faith applied to your life. and why it matters in the first place. For James, faith in Christ is the key to a community as a whole thriving the way that Christ has called them to and being what Jesus actually wants his church to be, to live out their commitment to him. And the way that he wants them to live out that commitment, go back and read any of the Gospels, lay your life down, love others, serve others, elevate those who can't themselves. So here's James saying, you want to live that? Here you go. Live it out. Do it. Care for the poor and actually show that you have real loyalty to this Jesus, because Jesus did that. So when you begin to walk through the book, it's not a long book, but there's a lot to it. It's a great little book. He opens with this introduction, kind of summarizing the main points he wants to cover. So he kind of like, here's the stuff we're going to talk about in this letter. A lot of wisdom-like statements that you kind of understand, like you kind of see some of it, like the way he talks about Proverbs, or the way you might read Proverbs. Standing strong through trials, praying for wisdom, asking God, having faith. All of these, though, centering around relationships within the church, the Christian community, that are often, unfortunately and wrongly, being divided between rich and poor and class and things like that, social status. And he's saying this is wrong. We got to stop this. So starting in the middle of chapter 1, he'll then spend some time talking to us about faith in practice. He dives into the idea that we have to be people who actually put our faith into action, or it isn't really faith at all. So he talks about guarding your tongue, caring for the poor, not showing favoritism to someone who seems greater by the world's standard, but showing faith through good deeds and actions that demonstrate your commitment to Christ. Because he will say, faith without works is dead. Now, again, let me just pause there. And again, I know this is just a survey class, but this is such a big deal. I want to hit on it. For James, faith is not belief. And for most early Christians, that was a big deal. Faith did not mean just believing something. Faith also wasn't just this passive, I've accepted something as true. Faith was commitment to Jesus. Faith was, I'm saying yes to this king. I'm entering the kingdom and making him Lord of my life. And I'm giving him my everything, my loyalty, my allegiance. I think a better way to think of faith, and I've taught on this other places, is even how, like up until just even the last century or so, faith was always used in pledges of fealty and loyalty to kings. Like if when the new king of England is crowned, people give their faith to him. It's a sense that you're in charge. I'm committing to you. And so for James to say, do you have faith in Jesus? He's saying, are you committed to him? Are you in this? Do you call yourself his follower? That means nothing if you don't do what he says. In many ways, you could just take Jesus' own words. Why do you call me Lord and not do what I say? Here's James saying, why do you call him Lord and not do what he says? Don't say you have faith and then not do anything. Faith that doesn't express itself as actually obeying the king isn't really allegiance. You're not actually loyal to that king if you're not doing what he says. If you're not making any effort to pattern your life off of him, you're not really a disciple, because disciples do what their teachers tell them to do and show them to do. So here's James saying, remember what Jesus showed us. He called us to lay our lives down and love each other and to get rid of the social divides and stop treating some people like lesser and care for the poor, love people. This is your faith in action. Now, in chapter 3 is when we really start to see the wisdom literature start to take off. And he speaks again about the importance of practical faith in action, how we treat each other. And really the reason we have so many problems and that we fight is because, we both want things, but we're warring. We don't. And so he talks about controlling your tongue, controlling your desires, steal the ship. And he says this, what people need for James is God's wisdom from above versus this wisdom from below. And now this is kind of wisdom literature, goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. What is wisdom from below? It's a serpent crawling on the ground saying, don't listen to God. He doesn't know what he's talking about, as opposed to the wisdom that comes from our Creator. James is saying, Jesus is the wisdom from above. Follow him, listen to him, obey him. The rest of the world around you, what Paul talks about in Romans as the pattern of this world, is going to tell you things that they're going to tell you are true and how you should live your life. Ignore that. It's not true. So seek the wisdom from God by following Christ and living out your faith by doing what he says and trusting that it's the wise course of action. And that will lead to a better community of people, a better society. It will lead to peace, unity, lifting up those who need to be lifted up, rather than a wisdom from below that says, get yours, do what makes you happy, do what feels good to you. you're powerful, enjoy it. He says, no, let go of all that. Follow Jesus in his wisdom and find life by losing this life. So James, in many ways, and I love this, maybe not word for word, the book of James is like putting into practice the words of Jesus in the gospel. It's like James is reading the book of John, maybe, well, probably wasn't written yet, but maybe he's reading Mark and he's remembering all the stuff his brother told him. Like, yeah, this is what this looks like in practice, guys, to love each other. And so in chapter 4, he really gets specific. Hey, those of you with money, don't abuse it. If you've got power and prestige and wealth and you're in the church, it's not just for you to hoard and all this stuff. He gives a very heavy warning against that. That's earthly wisdom that tells you that it's all yours and you just make yourself great. Instead, be generous, be compassionate, show your faith by giving and caring for the poor and lowly. Don't say you have faith and then hoard all of your money and all that kind of stuff. On the other hand, those of you that are suffering or being persecuted or are persecuted or being put down by others in power, stand firm, keep going, trust Jesus, keep going after him. And then, so he's kind of speaking to both, but really the heavy part is those at the top showing their faith by caring for those at the bottom. So the big idea of James, to close out, is really that God has called us to be a different kind of people. And he showed us, he taught us what that looked like by becoming a human being, Jesus in the flesh, and living it out and teaching us that healthy, restored humanity gets rid of all the power plays and the I'm rich and you're poor, so I'm in, and the poor, the rich take care of the poor, and we all choose to love and serve each other and lift each other up, and that is living with faithful commitment to our Messiah, our King, following his wisdom for our lives, uplifting others, not always striving just for our own gain. Having faith in Christ means obeying Christ's command to be humble, to love the world, and to see hope and healing come about by following the example of Jesus, wisdom from above. Great book. I love the book of James. So make sure you get a chance to read through it. Take your time. It's got some great stuff in it. And it's a good book. And we'll continue our study together moving forward after this with the books of 1st and 2nd Peter. Thanks, guys.